This is The Camp with Zach Heilprin and the Athletics' Jesse Temple.
Yes, welcome back. We're fully into the offseason, but it's going to get quite busy here very, very soon, Jesse, as Wisconsin is going to be welcoming in quite a few this weekend for official visits. I believe the number is 15. Is that accurate?
They've got four of the 15 are commits, 11 are uncommitted, but it's officially official visit season, which is a big, big deal everywhere, but especially at a place like Wisconsin.
Yep. So we'll get into that. I know that we've talked a lot about how many guys they landed from their official visits last June in terms of what their class ended up being. So we'll get into that. Going to talk a little bit about the latest commit on the transfer portal. Should we talk about like them adding like a 5-star like quarterback at some point, and then it's never going to happen, and then like the next day it'll pop, it'll happen?
Our timing is uncanny. I don't know how many times we've texted each other like 10 minutes after we finished recording a show and something has already happened, because the last time we did one of these, we were discussing the program striking out on defensive linemen in the portal. I will say at the very end, when you said, is there anybody, like, do you expect them to add anyone? And I said, I don't know. I said, if there was going to be one, it would be on the defensive line. My question is, who's left? Well, technically, nobody who was uncommitted was left. It just so happened that Brandon Lane, the defensive lineman, had been committed to Louisville, and before that committed to Michigan State, and before that he started out at Stephen F. Austin. So if I had known the entire roster of guys who were committed, then maybe I would have said there's clearly someone left.
Yeah, so we'll talk about Brandon Lane here coming up in a little bit. And then I want to get into a little bit of like who's under the most pressure. We kind of did this last fall, as I think it might have been leading into our season preview, just like who's under the most pressure. And the names probably might be a little bit similar as to last year, but I think the pressure may be jacked up a little bit. So we'll talk about that coming up. But I think it's worthwhile here to start with the guys who are going to be coming in this weekend, this Friday, Saturday, Sunday period for their official visits. It is, we all know, I mean, you've done extensive, and we've talked about it, you've done extensive stories on some of the stuff that goes on during these visits. You know, I think they played laser tag inside Camp Randall last year. They had like a, you broke down what all the money was spent on the parents that were having all the drinks, not just drinks, but dinners and all that good stuff too. So it's a very important weekend, and we all know how big of a job they did last year and the number of guys that they got to commit off these visits. But when you look at this list, you mentioned that there's 4 guys committed. Outside of those 4 guys, which ones are you kind of looking at and being like, ooh, I think this could be a big weekend for this particular guy?
Well, to start, just to recap what you're talking about, to give people a little bit of perspective on what the official visit season was like last year. It was the first one under this staff with Luke Fickell. And the story that I wrote, I think it published in February, but it went into some of the open records requests. And over the first 2 weekends of official visit season, they spent more than $319,000. Now, a lot of that is lodging. You're staying at the Edgewater. It's a pretty ritzy setup. You get all your meals. And like you said, there's fun stuff like laser tag that you get to do, but it's effective. And I think that's the biggest point. You can bemoan how much a school spends on it, but they had 10 uncommitted players come in on the first weekend of official visit season last year. 6 of those guys committed. And I think of the 22 guys that ultimately signed, 13 of them were part of this official visit season, and they were initially committed when they came to Wisconsin. So they either committed that weekend or they took additional official visits to other schools and then committed to Wisconsin. So I want to get that out of the way up top, just to illustrate how important these official visits are. But in terms of the list of guys that they have, I think what's really interesting this year is they are going after some very high level guys. And we have seen before, there have been players that maybe they didn't have the biggest offer list, or Wisconsin was clearly the front runner, and you just kind of knew that they were going to commit on the opening weekend. And I think there are some of these guys that they might take all their official visits, and Wisconsin may have a feel for some of them, but they're going to have to ride it out. I know there are at least a few that, I don't know if commitment watch is the right way to put it, but one guy I'd be looking at is Raheem Stroud, who's a cornerback from Tampa Bay Tech. They feel like he's pretty under recruited. But if you get someone up on the first official visit to Wisconsin, like that is really when they kind of put the pedal to the metal. And I think there are at least going to be a couple of these guys who end up committing. He would be one. But in terms of like really big names that people have heard of, I mean, they've got a couple outside linebackers who are 4-star level. Jaden Woods is one of them. He's visited here a few different times. And I think he could be in the mix. A guy they really like is an inside linebacker named Mason Posa. And he's got like Oregon, Texas A&M, and Wisconsin. So kind of to my point, these are guys with just they're national recruits. And, they're going to put their best foot forward. But I think some of these are going to come down to how these other official visits go too.
How big is it that they have those 4 guys that are already committed as a part of this? Like, I know last year it was kind of like Mabry, Matoyer was part of that first official visit. And I know there were other guys too, but it was important to have guys that were already committed being here and kind of showing these guys what they could be a part of.
I mean, it's huge. The 4 are, so Cameron Miller is the slot receiver who recently committed in these are all obviously 2025 recruits. They've got the 2 in-state guys, the offensive lineman, Michael Rusky, and then Cooper Catalano, who's the linebacker. And then the 4th is Jameer Scott, who's from Mount Healthy, Ohio. He's a safety defensive back. But I think it's big because, well, first of all, for those 4 guys, this is a great experience.
Just before we go on, is Leteju's coming too, right?
Oh, yeah. My math is bad.
That's 5.
Yeah, Sam Ladeju, I think, is – so that's 5, right? So I guess there's 10 uncommitted and 5 committed. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out.
Well, I rarely get to do that. It's usually you being like, well, actually. So finally, it happened.
The list is so long.
7 years into the swing in the camp, and I finally got an opportunity to correct you.
Yes. Well, we are all about being factual here, so it is important.
This is a big moment for me. I'll be honest.
I'm glad I can make your day and maybe your month. But it's really important just in general because those guys, they've been here, so they understand what this place is about, and they can sell that message to the other guys. That has made a huge difference over the years where you got someone, and some of these guys coming on officials, it's the first time they've ever been up to Madison. Obviously, Wisconsin has done enough to have them come at this point, but they don't know anything about this place other than what they've heard. So when you've got 4 or 5 guys who are already committed telling you why they have committed, I think it can make a huge difference. And I think at this point, Wisconsin has 11 committed players in the 2025 class. So they're really only about halfway home. And there's obviously a lot of work to go. And I would expect it to be pretty much all but filled out by the end of the month based on how these official visits go.
What do you think the number is going to end up being?
Well, so that's always hard because I think in part of the transfer portal, it was a lot easier way back when, only a few years ago, when you didn't have that because you wouldn't necessarily be expecting this mass exodus at the end of every season where that's just the case now. I will say that when I talked to Luke last summer for that big couple of big stories just on recruiting and his approach, he was very clear that the goal every year is to have 20 to 25 high school players signed in the class. And that would be my expectation every year that Luke and his staff are here. And last year it ended up being, I believe, 22. So it will be somewhere in that range is my assumption.
Just based on some of these names that are going to be coming in here, what are the positions that they're looking at to try and fill in this class? Obviously, outside linebacker seems to be a priority again, or I should say edge players is a priority again, and wide receiver as well, but and the secondary.
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything. Like there are a few offensive linemen that they have coming in. Nolan Davenport is another Ohio kid, and I think that's another thing worth pointing out is when you study the breakdown on where they're recruiting, we knew that Ohio was going to be a big deal for them. It already has been. Not necessarily to the extent that it was at Cincinnati, obviously, but he's an offensive tackle that AJ Blazek recruited at Vanderbilt. And there's another guy who's a 6'4" offensive guard. So I think they're trying to fill out a little bit of everywhere. Cade Petschok is a D lineman from North Dakota who's got some big-time offers. Oklahoma is probably another school along with Wisconsin that is in the mix at this point. But they need everything other than, what they already have. They've got the quarterback with Landon Locke, Braden's younger brother, and a couple other positions. So it's interesting to kind of see the positions that they're recruiting right now.
It is. There's a bunch of interesting names. I'm interested to see how this plays out for them coming up this weekend. All right, let's transition here a little bit to the transfer portal that we thought was dead and is now not dead, obviously. But Brandon Lane, defensive lineman, who has gotten. I mean, I'm not going to say gotten around. That's rude. I'm not going to say that. But obviously has had a few different stops before, coming to Wisconsin, and I believe he started at North Dakota. Was that is that right? It was another school, and then ended up at Stephen F. Austin, and then obviously is committed to a couple different programs before ending up at Wisconsin. But he's a big body that played a bunch of football at the FCS level. Do we think he's able to come in and make an impact, or is he just a depth piece?
My thought is he better be able to come in and make an impact. If you're going to put all this effort into some of these D linemen, especially in the transfer portal, they've got some positions where they've recruited and it's like, oh, you have 3 years left. You get a year or two, work your way in. I don't really feel like they have that luxury on the defensive line. And we talked about this on multiple occasions during the spring, just who they have. You have James Thompson Jr., who's really the only proven guy in terms of productivity. He had 3 sacks last season. And then you've got Kurt Neal, who started in the bowl game, Ben Barton, who if they have 3 defensive linemen on the field, you would assume that would be the 3. And beyond that, it's Cade McDonald, it's Elijah Hills, another FCS transfer in from Albany this offseason. You need guys who can be playmakers. And so I think the hope would be you got Brandon Lane. And I think it's also worth pointing out, a highly coveted player, as I said before, initially committed to Michigan State, then decommitted, then committed to Louisville, and then ended up decommitting and signing with Wisconsin, which is another point worth mentioning. He's not just committed, he is actually signed, because as soon as I put this out there on X, everybody was like, oh, where's he going to be next week? Well, he is signed, so they got that.
What does that mean? What does that mean? Is
this the player to be named later in the Chucky Hepburn deal, by the way?
It's a possibility. I thought the same thing. Who would you rather have?
Oh, boy. Tough not to have a 3-year starting point guard who is going to be your 4-year guy when we don't necessarily know what Brandon Lane's role is going to be. But to get back to your question, yeah, I would think that he's got to be a part of the rotation at minimum. But just like the Elijah Hill situation, it's impossible for us to know anything beyond speculation until we actually have a chance to see what he looks like and how the group looks like in fall camp, because you looked at the numbers that Hills had at Albany and you thought, okay, that's really good. And he started out with the 13 unit and really only worked his way into the second team unit after TJ Bowler's entered the transfer portal.
Yeah, I was wrong. Wrong Dakota, South Dakota State. He spent his first year there. I believe played 3 games there and had 1 tackle before ending up down at Stephen F. Austin the last couple of seasons. So, not last couple of seasons, last season. And it's a needed position, right? It's obviously a spot where they needed to add. It's where they desperately wanted to add. It felt like they exuded more effort at the defensive line spot than any other spot in the portal. And I don't know that they necessarily had a ton of success just because everyone else was in the exact same boat as them, trying to add big guys along the line. And that's just what it is. It's why certain guys that we looked at Wisconsin being like, I mean, they're fine players, but then you go out and see Gio Paez end up at LSU, or, Rodis Johnson end up Texas A&M. It's like, those are 2 programs. And I know Wisconsin has had a lot of success, but you look at LSU, I mean, those are premier programs, or I should say LSU is a premier program in the SEC. Texas A&M throws its money all over the place, doesn't always work on the field, but like, those are significant programs putting money towards those guys that maybe a lot of people in Wisconsin are like, yeah, fine. It's not like Wisconsin made a huge effort to keep like a Rodis Johnson. I know they probably wanted Gio Paez back, but like made like a huge effort to bring him back. Everyone wants a big, experienced defensive lineman in the transfer portal, and that's why I think obviously Wisconsin was so involved in it. Just didn't always go their way, and we'll see if they kind of hit one, hit a single that maybe turns into a triple here with Brandon Lane. We'll see how this ends up playing out for them. All right, let's move on here a little bit, Jesse, and get into something that I know we talked about last offseason. who's under the most pressure going into this upcoming season. And I think Phil Longo was up there last year. I think Tanner Mordecai may have been up there. Luke Fickell probably as well. Chris McIntosh certainly, I think, made the list as well last year. But for you, if you had to choose right now, who would be the person that you would say is under the most pressure going into this fall?
It's probably the same name we said last year. To me, it's got to be Phil Longo, especially when you're coming off a season that was not anywhere close to what the expectations were. 23.5 points a game. That's the fewest in 19 years. And I will say that based on what we saw in the spring, I don't want to speak for you, but I think the general consensus is there's reason for optimism and encouragement. And you and I have been more measured in our observations this offseason. But until you go and do it on the field, it's all just talk. And the other question is, even if they are better, how much better do they need to be for anybody to feel like they are at a level that is sustainable long term? But why did they bring Phil Longo in here? It was to alter what Wisconsin's offense was going to be. Yes, they were still going to run the ball. Yes, they still did run the ball, but you want to be able to pass more. You're running this shotgun, no huddle spread offense, and it just wasn't any better than what it was under Paul Chryst. And so I think without question, he's got to be the guy who's under the most pressure. And one of the reasons I would say that as well is what happens in a hypothetical world where the offense isn't any better in year two? Then I think you've got some very serious questions that as a staff and you've got to start answering. And certainly we're not there yet, but that is a lot of pressure.
It's a ton of pressure. And as you said, we've been more measured coming out this year, especially what we saw in spring. So I don't want to sit here and say, yeah, that it looks like that they're going to be a ton better and they're going to score a bunch of points. But I thought that they're going to be pretty good coming out of spring last year. And a lot of big plays in the pass game last year. I do think that they're evolved further than they were at this time last year. How could you not be? They're in a much better spot, you would think, to have success than they were last year. But, we heard Phil Longo say, I've had success in the first year everywhere I've been. It's like and then that success did not come last year. And so it's tough to just take everybody at their word at this point. You know what I mean? Like you just have to say, okay, I believe that you're going to be better. I believe that these things are going to happen, but it's just a wait and see situation. So there's a ton of pressure on Phil Longo. If it does not go, I don't know what the point per game has to be. We're not going to be Iowa here and say he has to hit this points per game. And if he doesn't, he's on the hot seat and he's out type of stuff. But it needs to be significantly better than last year. What would be significantly better than last year?
You're asking me to put a number on it?
Yeah. Like is 30 a realistic number?
No, I don't think that it is.
Okay.
And that should be a part of this conversation as well. I can't think about the 2024 season without acknowledging the difficulty of the schedule. And look, it is what it is. Some years it's easier, some years it's harder. And every team right now in the Big Ten is going to have matchups that are not favorable. But when you've got 3 top 15 opponents, in all likelihood, and you don't know, maybe they'll lose some games early. You got Alabama. Oregon's even better than Alabama, at least on paper at this point. Penn State. You got to go to Iowa, which presumably will be a top 25 type team. They've got a new offensive coordinator. I don't think their defense is going to be bad all of a sudden. And that doesn't
even most of those guys back.
Yeah, that doesn't even include some of these other games that have been toss-ups or games you started to lose against your former Big Ten West teams. So it's a tremendously difficult schedule. And because of that, it's hard to see them putting up 30-plus points per game. Having said that, it's more consistency across the board. And I think ultimately that will lead to more points. I don't want to say, it's 26.5, that's a good number. It also has to do with how your defense does and how you're able to win games and perform in high pressure moments. But clearly they need to take a step up offensively. And that is the expectation from inside the program.
How good does it have to be for him not to be on the hot seat? Like that, maybe it's an unfair question at this point. It probably is, but I'm going to ask it anyways and put it towards you and be like, hey, like what for you? Like, even if it's not a points per game, what shows you that there's progress being made here?
Well, The scoring is pretty important. Obviously, I think.
But you don't want to do that. You don't want to give me a points per game.
Well,
so
right.
I need something else from you.
Right. You need a few barometers on what it looks like. I think about the fact that I'm not the only one who said this, that Wisconsin could be a better football team next season and yet have a very similar record. They finished 7-5 in the regular season a year ago. And if they go 7-5, I think it will certainly be a disappointment. But again, consider who they have to play this year. But I mean, like 9-3 to me feels like a pretty successful year with this schedule. I think 8-4, some fans may take that, even if you're not necessarily happy with it because of where you think this program should go. And I bring that up just when we're referencing what the offense should be doing. I look at in part like the what did they have? 11 touchdown passes last year, something like that. Tanner Mordecai came in, and yes, I know he missed a month of the season, but it wasn't particularly good even before then. You'd like to see Tyler Van Dyke be able to have some of these big games. Not that it has to look like what Tanner Mordecai did against LSU, but you would take some of those kinds of performances where you can also run the ball effectively. That's why Longo's here, to marry these two things. You still have Ches Malusi. You brought in a transfer running back who was as good as anybody I felt like among the portal guys this spring, Tawee Walker, who could be your 1 and 2. And you've got Van Dyke, who at one point was projected to be a first-round NFL draft pick. That's how good he was as a freshman in the ACC at Miami. If he can recapture that magic with the wide receivers that you have, I feel like there's no excuse other than you're playing some difficult teams not to be more balanced and more consistently effective.
Yeah, I would agree. They threw for 14 touchdowns last year, only 5 interceptions. I think maybe in previous incarnations of Wisconsin, that'd be a pretty good season for a quarterback. But when you're doing what Wisconsin's doing with this system, it's not. And they just didn't score enough points overall to win enough games, to win more games. Like they played well enough. Like everyone took shots at the defense last year. And I don't know that they were unwarranted, especially early in games, but they played well enough defensively to win a bunch more games than they actually did. And that has obviously a lot to do with the defense, right? I mean, I know Northwestern, what they did in the first half. I get it. Certainly Indiana as well. But those are 2 games that Wisconsin should have won just based on if they put up more points. Now, the Northwestern game, again, they were not necessarily in that game at any point because they got down. But the defense played well enough at points last year to have more wins than they ended up getting. I think that, to me, is fair to say. They have to obviously limit the very good starts for teams, right? I mean, you think about the Northwestern game, you think about the Indiana game, you think about the Nebraska game, for that matter. Go back to the Washington State game. There were just so many times that the defense kind of were on their heels, and then they kind of figured things out as the game went along. But offensively, Phil Long was under a ton of pressure. Who else is facing some pressure this year? I know we talked last week about Luke Fickell, someone having him on the hot seat. He's not, but I think there is some pressure towards this, right? Like there has to be some signs of progress from the team overall, and he has to obviously take a huge part of that.
Absolutely. He would have been number 2 on this list for me, and that doesn't mean that if they go 7-5 or 6-6, Chris McIntosh is going to make a drastic decision a la the Paul Chryst situation. No, I mean, they brought Luke in for the long haul, and very clearly based on how everything ended under Paul and what year 1 looked like under Luke, this is a long-term plan. The fix was not going to be quick. So we should all, if we haven't acknowledged that yet, make that very clear. Having said that, when you are brought in at an average annual salary of $7.8 million, and you are tasked with changing the program that is the one that makes the most money, the one that has the most eyeballs on it, there's a lot of pressure. And he puts it on himself too. I felt like when I talked to him this offseason, he was very candid and revealing, at least as much as a head coach is going to be, about the shortcomings and failures of year 1. And he puts a lot of that on himself as the head coach. So the ability to adapt to whatever failures there were and improve in year 2 is going to be essential. And absolutely the pressure has to fall as much on him as anybody. I
look at also in terms of big names that are You would think that would be under a little pressure, and it's because it kind of goes hand in hand with Luke Fickell. It's Chris McIntosh. He desperately needs. I shouldn't say desperately, but he needs there to be progress made because as we've said, they are tied at the hip together. If Luke Fickell does not work out, if Luke Fickell is, again, I don't know why we're being. I feel like being a little negative here, but if it's a failure, if it ends up not working, well, Chris McIntosh has to answer that. I don't think that he gets another chance to hire a head coach. I don't know how you feel about that. Maybe I'm wrong in that, but I feel like at this time last year I felt that way, and I don't feel any different here. That's tough. I know.
Well, it depends. I mean, like, it depends on what happens. If it's just an epic flame out in 4 years, that's one thing. If there's a rise and a decline and it lasts the better part of a decade, like I think this is going to be, barring Luke leaving for another situation, I would expect him to be here for quite a while, because at least what he did at Cincinnati, which is really the best opportunity we have since it's his first full-time head coaching opportunity, strikes me as a builder. Could have had a lot of opportunities for jobs, and in particular the year where they went to the college football playoff, and he didn't want to entertain those offers while they're trying to win a national championship. But I just feel like he's the type of guy who embraces a challenge and is going to do everything he can to try and meet that challenge. Now, that doesn't mean it always works out, but I feel like this is going to be something that lasts more than just a few years. And I know that Wisconsin certainly doesn't want to be the type of program that we've seen at other places where every 3 or 4 years you're replacing a head coach. Essentially, the last thing you want to do is become what Nebraska has become, where you had, Bo Pelini's tenure was probably up and down, but he won a lot of games. And then they had a bunch of different coaches after that, and I can't say that they were any better afterwards. So I think this will be long-term for Luke, but obviously the proof is in the pudding, and you got to go win on the field.
They haven't made a bowl game in a very, very long time. It's
crazy.
Like, it's coming up on a decade. Like, it's been a long time. I want to say 2016 may have been their last bowl game. It's been a while. It's been a while for them. So, but that is also kind of the move that Chris McIntosh made, though, right? Like, I mean, he made the same move that Nebraska did in getting rid of a guy who was a consistent winner in Frank Solich, who's obviously came off the Osborne tree and was his guy for a long time, and changed things up. Bill Callahan, and went away from everything that made them who they were. I'm not saying Wisconsin has done that. They certainly have made significant changes to who they were, even though they still want to have the same mindset of, being able to run the ball and playing tough defense and all that good stuff. But they're definitely a different program now than they were, just a couple of years ago. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. They needed change. They desperately needed change from what had been happening and what you could say was a pretty, I don't want to say a drastic decline. And then they won 9 games in 2021, right? But it was clear that things had started to trend downhill, and it did not look as if Paul Chryst would be a great fit for what college football was becoming and has become, if we're being totally fair. So there was a lot to that. And I'm just saying that they made a very Nebraska type move, and we'll see if it ends up paying out or playing out the way that they wanted to, or the way that it has for Nebraska. But I think anybody at Wisconsin, would you take what Bo Pelini did at Nebraska? I think you kind of would, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Like a lot of double digit win seasons. I mean, there was a lot. I mean, big games weren't necessarily his forte, but there was a lot of success there, and I think Nebraska fans would take that back in a second too. I guess we'll see how it plays out with Matt Rule. If we're talking about pressure on certain players, is there anybody that comes to mind? I mean, we've talked about coaches, but is there pressure on individual players? I think one guy that you kind of already mentioned was Tyler Van Dyke.
Yeah.
Anytime you're coming in, and same thing for Tanner Mordecai last year, anytime you're coming in and being asked to be the guy in an offense, assuming he wins the job, there's a ton of, you get 1 year, and that's it. And you got to make it work. And if it doesn't work, well, too bad. And that is, I think, a lot of pressure on a guy. This is whether he's going to have a career past college or if he's not, is kind of going to be made this year.
The degree of pressure on any player to me pales in comparison to any of the coaches, in part because of if you have more than 1 year left, there's an easy out to go somewhere else and try and start over if it doesn't work out. But absolutely, number one, as among players, has to be on Van Dyke, quarterback. Certainly, you generally have a lot of pressure. But I go back to what I said before, that after he won ACC Rookie of the Year in 2021 at Miami, he was projected to be a first-round NFL draft pick, and things haven't worked out since then. Miami didn't win enough games. He hadn't been able to stay healthy. He's been benched a couple of times. He got benched last season after he had a 2-game stretch where I think he threw 5 picks and no touchdowns, ended up coming back because the guy who replaced him got hurt. And I thought Van Dyke showed some good mental fortitude to finish out pretty strong. But you're making this move not only for a fresh start, but to prove that you can do something beyond this year and be an NFL type of player. So there's got to be a lot of pressure on him. It's a different situation, like we talked about, just because when Tanner Mordecai got here, he was unquestionably the guy. And Van Dyke has got to earn it in a little bit different way based on what we saw in the spring between he and Braden Locke, although I fully expect it to be Van Dyke when Wisconsin takes the field for week 1. But yeah, I don't honestly think there's any other player that I can say there's a ton of pressure on individually, even though there are guys that are vital to the success of this team, if that makes sense.
It does. And I would agree with you that Tyler Van Dyke's up there. But I think a guy like Jack Nelson,
who you're going to say that. It's a good one.
Who had a really, a tough 2023, right? Like, he went into the season, a lot of people expected him to be an all Big Ten type of player. And even take out the penalties, and if we just ignore the penalties, it probably wasn't the season that he wanted to have. I don't know that means he doesn't have the talent to be that guy, right? Like, I think he certainly does have that talent. And we heard, Luke Fickell, and maybe he's just building the guys up, but he feels really good about those two guys, Riley Wallman and Jack Nelson on the outside, that those kind of feel like they're stakes, right? Like, they're the ones that the line's going to be built around. But Jack Nelson has some pressure on him to perform this year because of what happened a year ago. I think a guy like Hunter Wohler, who we talk about all the time being this great player and this great playmaker, if we're being fair, he needs to make more plays. And he said that this spring too, right? Like, like, how do we get him in a better position to make even more plays than he does? He's an absolute tackling monster last year, just making tackles. It felt like a double-digit number of tackles every single week to start that season. But where are the forced fumbles? Where are the interceptions? Where are the pass deflections? Like that, if you want to be considered that guy, well, those are the type of things that I think have to come along with it. So I'm not saying he's under pressure, but I think that there is pressure on him to perform and be a big-time playmaker that we all think he can be. Who else? James Thompson Jr., right? Like, we have – and maybe I'd throw Kurt Neal in there too. Those are two guys that they're counting on significantly. We've already mentioned their lack of depth along the defensive line. Can they be chaos type of guys in a front that needs chaos to have success? We saw early last season, James Thompson Jr., I think he ended up leading the defensive line in sacks, right? Like, he had 3.5, which is fine. Kurt Neal, chaos in the bowl game in that one big time play on 3rd and short. It might have even been 4th and short, where he took the guard and like just pushed him right back into the center, right back into the running back for a stop. Those guys need to make plays like that on a consistent basis. So I think there's pressure on them as well. So I could probably go position by position and find some guys that have some things that they need that there is some pressure on them to perform if the team and that side of the ball is going to work.
When I think of pressure, I think about who has the most at stake. And that's why I think when you bring up Nelson and Wohler, they're very good candidates. And I would, if I had to make a list of players, they would be in my top tier along with Tyler Van Dyke, just because of their NFL potential and what they do as college players, especially this year, is going to impact what their future could be in this sport. Because Jack Nelson, before last season, I would have said he's going to start every game in 2023, and he's gone. And that probably would have been the plan if he had performed better, hadn't had the penalties, everything else that happened. And same with Wohler for where he's at right now. Like you mentioned, he had a ton of tackles, and he said he wanted to be the type of player who could be on SportsCenter, where you see a DB and everyone's looking around going, well, where did he come from? He made a play that people didn't expect him to make. And that is one of the things that can elevate him into being a higher level prospect in the NFL. So I think absolutely those guys would fall into that category along with Van Dyke, because to me, those are players that at least at some point have been projected to be NFL players that have a lot of potential for the pros, but have to go out and do it on the field at an extremely high level. And some of those other players, they could put themselves in position to be NFL players. I don't know. And again, they're integral parts to the success of this team. But I think those three are ones that absolutely stand out.
For sure. Before we finish up, there is going to be some more announcements here in terms of kickoff times. Now, your colleagues at The Athletic, I don't know if, I'm sure you saw that, they projected some kickoff times for the first 3 weeks. I believe it was Scott Dochterman and Stuart Mandel. And not unexpected. I kind of felt like, and who knows if it ends up happening, but it kind of felt like one of these. That Western Michigan game opening up on a Friday night, if it happens, it kind of makes sense to me, but I'm looking forward to all the outrage that Wisconsin has taken away Friday nights from the high school kids.
Oh,
again.
yes. Well, I mean, you can't spell media without not only an I, but an M and an E. And there have been a lot of Friday night openers in the last, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. No one likes them. Maybe fans do, except that they're over at 10:30, 11. And obviously, if you've got to write some stories, you just don't sleep at all. But I'm all in favor of the 11 a.m. games. I guess the only exception would be, it would have been nice if the Alabama game was a little bit later. But the good news is none of the Big Ten games that Wisconsin plays are going to be on Friday night. So everybody who's a high school enthusiast can have that night to themselves.
See, I don't think that's true. I don't know if that, I think that might be true. Like, it's not, they're not going to be on Fox, but it doesn't mean they couldn't be on FS1 or BTN.
I thought they were already all announced of,
No, those were just the Fox games. They said that they're going to announce further Friday night games on FS1 and Big Ten Network, and I think obviously that Western Michigan game feels likely. Again,
I meant the Big Ten opponents, specific Big Ten, not the non-conference games.
Yeah, again, I think they might not be Friday night games. I mean, they might. Who knows? All I know is what the announcement last week that was about the Fox games, right? Was these 11 or 12 Friday night games on Fox. They mentioned that other games, earlier season games, could be on FS1 or BTN. I don't know about whether any of the other Big Ten games could be at night or on a Friday night. Probably not. You're probably right on that. But I guess we'll find out. I don't obviously like a Friday, especially early in the season, a Friday night game. It's Western Michigan. Like, can you swap those two? Can you put Alabama on a Friday night and put Western Michigan at 11 a.m. just to get it done with? I guess we'll see. That was just a projection. It was not a guarantee. It's not anything that has actually happened. It was just a projection from The Athletic. We'll see if it actually ends up playing out that way. I know you did your list ranking the best or the most intriguing games on the schedule. Where did Western Michigan come in on that one?
Minor controversy among probably 4 people who actually cared, but I put them at 10 ahead of the Rutgers game and Piscataway. But I did that largely, this is probably just selfish reasons. Look, if you're putting together any list, it's going to be your own perspective, and everyone is going to have their own opinion. Season openers are always intriguing to me because you don't actually know what the team you're covering or you're a fan of looks like until you get to see it. So I want to know whether there's a substantial difference. Is this offense any better? Is this defense any better? Do we feel like this team can actually compete at a higher level in the Big Ten? You might not necessarily know from a potential week 1 blowout, but you'd know if it's a 3-point game or you happen to lose. And so to me, that's more intriguing than going to Piscataway and having to watch Rutgers. But I think my number 1, very clearly, I feel like, was Alabama. I don't know how you can say that that's not the most intriguing game on the schedule other than the fact it's 11 a.m. I actually put Oregon number 2, largely because I think it's the best team Wisconsin is going to play. And I do think there's some intrigue factor in just seeing teams you don't normally get to see every year. I had Iowa. I think I had Iowa at number 3, and I get there is one part that's like, you just see them every year. It's the same type of game, but to me, that is such a measuring stick for a team that has beaten you a couple times in a row, and you've got to go to Iowa City and Minnesota. Look, whether Minnesota is good or bad, it's Minnesota, and the PJ Fleck factor is there, and now they're stealing each other's players in recruiting, and so I think that kind of ups the ante a little bit. So those were my top 4, but there's a lot of really good ones.
There were a lot of people that apparently weren't happy with your rankings.
Yeah, well, so
that's going to happen.
I mean, because I had like USC at the Coliseum number 5, and Northwestern too high. But my intrigue in going to Northwestern is seeing a game in a venue that I'll never have a chance to see it again because the lake is on 3 sides of the field, and I'm sure it'll be too windy to kick the ball more than 26 yards.
I will say this about your number 12. South Dakota's supposed to be pretty good this year.
Okay, but
I know it's an FCS opponent. I'm just saying I understand it's an FCS opponent, but I think that being sandwiched, right before the Alabama game, I'm not saying upset watch or anything like that. I'm just saying that there is a possibility that game could be a little bit tighter than maybe we're thinking at this point. It's not intriguing.
Yeah,
it's not intriguing. I'm not saying it's intriguing. I'm saying it might be a little bit closer than some might think. But we've got a couple more months before that, or 3 or 4 months before that. So we'll see. Lots to dive into the next couple of months, and especially after this coming weekend. I'm sure we're going to have some commitments to talk about coming off what is a huge official visit weekend. Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach.
All right, there he is, Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Camp.